Dolly Parton was enjoying a rare moment of solitude as she strolled through the quiet streets of Pigeon Forge, her hometown. The golden light of the setting sun cast a warm glow on the sidewalks, and she relished the chance to be just another person in the crowd. No cameras, no entourage, just her and her thoughts. As she turned a corner, she noticed a man sitting on the ground, his back against a weathered brick wall. His clothes were tattered, his shoes nearly falling apart, and in front of him was a small tin cup with a few scattered coins. He looked weary, but his eyes held a spark of resilience that caught Dolly's attention. "Excuse me, ma'am," the man called out in a raspy voice, lifting his head to meet her gaze. "Could you spare $1? Just enough for a bite to eat." Dolly stopped in her tracks. It wasn't the first time she'd been approached by someone in need, but there was something about him that made her pause. Maybe it was the way he spoke, with a quiet dignity that seemed to defy his circumstances. Or maybe it was the smudged wedding ring on his finger, hinting at a story far more profound than she could imagine. $1? She repeated softly, reaching into her purse. But before she could pull out the bill, a sudden screech of tires shattered the evening calm. A car careened around the corner, its headlights glaring as it sped dangerously close to the sidewalk. Dolly barely had time to step back as the vehicle roared past, narrowly missing her. "Watch out!" the man shouted, his voice urgent as he instinctively placed himself between her and the speeding car. For a moment, he seemed to forget his own frailty, standing protectively in front of her. Dolly's heart raced. "Are you all right?" she asked, her voice trembling with concern. "I'm fine," he replied, though his hands were visibly shaking. "But ma'am, you shouldn't be here. It's not safe around these parts at night." That was the moment Dolly realized this man wasn't just another face in the crowd. He had a story, and perhaps even a strength, that went beyond what met the eye. She decided then and there to find out more. Dolly stood frozen for a moment, the echoes of the screeching tires fading into the distance. Her heart was still pounding, but her gaze remained fixed on the man in front of her. His shoulders sagged under the weight of exhaustion, yet there was something unyielding in his posture, a quiet determination that intrigued her. "What's your name?" she asked, her voice soft but steady. The man hesitated, as if weighing the consequences of revealing too much. "Earl," he said finally. "Earl Jenkins." Dolly nodded, repeating the name in her mind. "Well, Earl, I reckon you just saved me from a nasty accident. Thank you for that." Earl offered a faint smile, though it didn't quite reach his eyes. "Guess that's the least I could do, ma'am. Not like I got much else to offer." Her eyes drifted to the tin cup on the ground, the scattered coins barely enough for a meal. Something about his tone resigned, but not bitter, stirred a memory deep within her. Dolly knew what it was like to have nothing, to feel invisible. "Earl, how did you end up here?" she asked gently, kneeling slightly so she could meet his eyes. He let out a long sigh, his gaze shifting to the ground. "Used to have a place out near Gatlinburg," he began, his voice tinged with both pride and regret. "It wasn't much, but it was home. Then the fire came through, took everything, my house, my tools, even my dog. I've been trying to get back on my feet ever since, but, well, here I am." Dolly's chest tightened. The fires. She remembered watching the news, horrified by the devastation that had swept through the area. Families displaced, lives uprooted in an instant. But Earl's story wasn't over. "And your family?" she pressed softly. Earl chuckled dryly, the sound devoid of humor. "My wife passed a few years back. Cancer. My boy. He moved to Atlanta after college. Haven't seen him in years. I don't blame him. I wasn't exactly the best dad after his mama died." He rubbed his hands together, as if trying to warm himself despite the mild evening air. "Guess I couldn't hold it all together." Dolly felt a lump forming in her throat. She reached into her bag and pulled out a neatly folded $20 bill, holding it out to him. "Here, Earl, this'll get you something more than just a bite to eat." Earl stared at the bill, his expression unreadable. "That's too much, ma'am." "I can't." "You can," she interrupted firmly, placing the money in his hand, "and you will." He blinked, his lips pressing together as he clutched the bill tightly. "You're too kind, ma'am. Folks like you don't come round here often." "Well, Earl," Dolly said with a small smile, "maybe that's the problem. More folks ought to come round." Just as she stood, a group of rowdy teenagers appeared at the end of the street, their laughter echoing off the walls. One of them spotted Earl and snickered. "Hey, old man. Still begging for scraps?" Earl stiffened, his fingers curling around the tin cup. Dolly turned sharply toward the boys, her voice cool but commanding. "You better think twice before disrespecting someone who's seen more life than you ever will." The boys faltered, exchanging uneasy glances before retreating into the night. Earl exhaled slowly, his shoulders relaxing. "You didn't have to do that, ma'am." "Maybe not," Dolly replied, her tone unwavering. "But I did." As the street grew quiet again, Dolly's mind raced with possibilities. Earl needed more than a hot meal. He needed a chance, a way to rebuild the life the fire had stolen from him. And if there was one thing Dolly Parton knew, it was how to turn ashes into something beautiful. Dolly couldn't shake the image of Earl from her mind as she walked away from the alley. His face, his story, it all stayed with her, gnawing at her heart. She knew she couldn't just leave him behind with nothing more than a $20 bill. Earl needed more than that. He needed hope. But before she could turn back, a loud clatter rang out behind her. Whirling around, she saw two men towering over Earl. One of them had knocked over his tin cup, scattering the few coins he had managed to collect. "I told you to get lost, old man." One of the men barked, kicking at Earl's wheelchair. Dolly's heart skipped a beat. Without hesitation, she ran back. "Hey," she called out, her voice sharp and commanding. "Leave him alone." The two men froze, turning to face her. One of them sneered. "What's it to you, lady?" Dolly planted herself firmly in front of Earl, her eyes blazing with determination. "It's my business because I'm not about to stand by and watch cowards like you pick on someone who's already down. Now get out of here before you regret it." For a moment, it looked like the men might push back, but then they recognized her. Dolly Parton wasn't just a name, they could feel the power in her presence. Muttering under their breath, they slunk off into the shadows. Earl, still visibly shaken, looked up at her. "Why'd you do that? Most folks would have just walked on by." Dolly knelt down beside him, picking up his overturned cup and gathering the scattered coins. "Because I'm not most folks, Earl. Nobody deserves to be treated like that." Earl nodded slowly, his eyes glistening with unshed tears. I don't even know how to thank you." "You don't need to," she replied, handing him the cup. But deep down, she knew this couldn't be the end. She couldn't just walk away, not after what she had seen. "Earl," she said, her voice gentle but firm, "meet me back here tomorrow morning. I have an idea that might help." Earl blinked at her, his expression a mix of curiosity and disbelief. "What kind of idea?" Dolly smiled softly, placing a reassuring hand on his shoulder. "You'll see. But for now, get yourself something to eat and try to get some rest." The night weighed heavily on Earl, sitting in his usual corner, clutching the $20 bill Dolly had given him. He couldn't shake the feeling that this was all too good to be true. Why would someone like her, a global icon, a living legend, care about someone like him? His life had been reduced to scraps of dignity, barely enough to hold on to. And yet, her words had sparked something inside him, a flicker of hope he hadn't felt in years. Morning came slowly, the first rays of sunlight creeping over the buildings. Earl hadn't slept. Instead, he spent the night replaying their conversation, wondering what idea Dolly could possibly have. By the time the town began to stir, he was back in the alley, waiting. And then, as if on cue, Dolly appeared, her unmistakable blonde hair catching the morning light. She wasn't alone. Behind her was a sleek black SUV, its tinted windows glinting in the sun. Earl's heart sank. Was this some kind of publicity stunt? Cameras? Reporters? But as she approached, Dolly waved off the vehicle, signaling it to park further away. No cameras, no entourage. Just her. "You're here," she said with a warm smile, as if she'd never doubted he would be. Earl nodded, the words caught in his throat. "I didn't sleep much either," she admitted, taking a seat on the low curb beside him. "Kept thinking about what you told me. About the fire, your family, everything you lost." Earl looked down, his hands gripping the armrest of his wheelchair. "I didn't mean to dump all that on you. You've got bigger things to worry about." Dolly chuckled softly. "You'd be surprised. Sometimes the biggest thing we can do is help someone right in front of us. Now, Earl, I've got a plan, but it's going to take a little trust." Earl frowned slightly, his curiosity piqued. "What kind of plan?" Dolly leaned in, her voice lowering as if she were sharing a secret. "I want to help you get back on your feet. But it's not just about money. I want to help you rebuild. Your life, your story, everything that fire tried to take from you." Earl blinked, the weight of her words sinking in. "Rebuild?" "Yes," she said, her tone resolute. "But first, I need to know one thing. Are you ready to fight for yourself? Because I can't do it alone." Earl's lips parted as if to respond, but before he could, a sudden voice interrupted. "Dolly, there you are." Earl turned to see a man stepping out of the SUV, dressed sharply in a tailored suit. He looked official, too official. "I thought we agreed no surprises," the man said, his tone clipped. "We're on a tight schedule." Dolly stood, her expression calm but firm. "This is more important, Fred. Schedule can wait." The man, clearly frustrated, glanced at Earl. His scrutinizing gaze made Earl shift uncomfortably in his chair. "Who's this?" "This," Dolly said, her voice steady, "is someone who needs our help. And if you're not willing to be part of that, then maybe you shouldn't be here." Fred's jaw tightened, but he backed down. "Fine, but you're cutting it close." As he retreated back to the SUV, Dolly turned to Earl, her eyes softening. "I've dealt with people like that my whole life. Don't let them get to you." Earl nodded, his chest tightening. For the first time in years, he felt like someone believed in him. "Now," Dolly said, clapping her hands lightly, "let's start with breakfast. Then we'll figure out the rest." But as they began to head down the street, Earl couldn't shake the nagging feeling that things wouldn't be that simple. He had no idea what challenges lay ahead, but for the first time, he was ready to face them. As they walked well, Dolly walked, and Earl rolled his wheelchair. They drew curious stares from people passing by. Earl kept his head down, gripping the wheels of his chair nervously. It wasn't every day you saw Dolly Parton walking side by side with a homeless man, and he could feel the judgmental eyes of strangers burning into him. Dolly, however, seemed completely unbothered. She stopped at a small diner, its neon open sign flickering in the morning light. "Best pancakes in town," she said with a grin, holding the door open for Earl. Inside, the atmosphere was warm, the smell of coffee and syrup filling the air. But as they entered, the din of conversation quieted. People turned to look at them, at her, at him. Earl's face burned with shame. "Table for two, please," Dolly said cheerfully to the stunned hostess, who quickly recovered and led them to a corner booth. Dolly slid into her seat, gesturing for Earl to join her across the table. He hesitated for a moment, feeling painfully out of place, but her encouraging smile gave him the push he needed. The waitress approached, her eyes widening as she recognized Dolly. "Oh my God, you're Dolly Parton." The waitress approached, her eyes widening as she recognized Dolly. "Oh my God, you're Dolly Parton." Dolly laughed lightly. "That's what they tell me. But I'm just here for some pancakes, darling. And my friend here will have whatever he wants." The waitress's gaze shifted to Earl, and he shrank under her scrutiny. Just coffee," he mumbled. "Nonsense," Dolly said, flipping open the menu. He'll have the full breakfast platter. Eggs, bacon, hash browns, and pancakes, and bring an extra side of biscuits." The waitress scribbled down the order, still starstruck, and hurried off. Earl leaned forward, lowering his voice. "You don't have to do all this, ma'am. I'm not. I don't belong here." Dolly's expression softened. "Earl, you belong wherever you want to be. Don't let anyone tell you different." Before he could respond, a man at a nearby table muttered loudly, "What's she doing with him?" Earl's shoulders tensed, and he looked away, but Dolly's eyes narrowed. She turned in her seat, fixing the man with a look so sharp it could cut steel. "Excuse me, sir," she said, her voice sweet but laced with steel. "Do you have something you'd like to say to me?" The man's face turned red, and he quickly buried his nose in his coffee cup. The room fell silent again, the weight of Dolly's words lingering in the air. "Some people," she muttered, shaking her head as she turned back to Earl, "don't ever let them make you feel small." The food arrived shortly after, and as Earl took his first bite, it was as if the weight of the world lifted from his shoulders, even if just for a moment. He hadn't had a proper meal in weeks, and the warmth of the food filled more than just his stomach. It gave him a flicker of hope. But just as he was beginning to relax, the bell above the diner door jingled, and two men in suits walked in. Earl froze. He recognized them immediately. They were from the shelter he'd been forced to leave after the fire, and they weren't exactly known for their kindness. "Earl Jenkins," one of them said loudly, scanning the room until his eyes landed on him. "We've been looking for you." Earl's fork froze midair, the warmth of the pancakes forgotten as his eyes locked on the two men. Their tailored suits and clipped voices stood in stark contrast to the casual diner atmosphere, making their presence feel more like an interrogation than a coincidence. Dolly immediately sensed his unease. "Earl," she said softly, leaning closer, "who are they?" He swallowed hard, his voice barely above a whisper. "They're from the shelter I stayed at after the fire. They weren't exactly helpful." The taller of the two men approached the booth, his sharp gaze moving between Earl and Dolly. "Mr. Jenkins," he said, his tone cold and authoritative, "we need to have a word." Dolly straightened in her seat, her signature charm giving way to a steely resolve. "If you have something to say, you can say it right here." The man's eyes flicked to her, a flicker of recognition crossing his face before he dismissed her with a slight sneer. "This doesn't concern you, ma'am." Dolly leaned back, crossing her arms. "Oh, I think it does. Earl here's my guest, and I'd appreciate it if you'd explain why you're disrupting our breakfast." The second man, shorter and visibly nervous, stepped forward. "We've been looking for Mr. Jenkins because he owes the shelter money. He left without settling his balance." Earl's hands clenched around his fork. "I left because you kicked me out. I didn't owe you anything. I couldn't even afford to stay there." The taller man's smirk grew colder. "Rules are rules, Mr. Jenkins. You stayed past the allotted time without contributing to the shelter's upkeep. That debt doesn't just disappear." Dolly's eyes narrowed. "You're telling me you threw a man out on the street after he lost everything, and now you're here to shake him down for more? That's disgraceful." The shorter man shifted uncomfortably, but his colleague stood firm. "We don't make the rules, ma'am. We just enforce them." "Well," Dolly said, her voice icy, "maybe it's time someone looked into your rules. Because from where I'm sitting, they're not worth the paper they're written on." Earl lowered his head, his face flushed with shame. "I'll figure it out," he murmured. "Just let me finish my breakfast and I'll go with you." Dolly reached across the table, her hand gently resting on his. "No, Earl, you're not going anywhere with them." Turning back to the men, her voice hardened. "If you think for 1 second I'm going to let you drag him out of here like some criminal, you've got another thing coming." The taller man opened his mouth to protest, but Dolly cut him off. "You want his debt settled? Fine, you'll have your money by the end of the day. But let me make one thing clear. If I find out you've treated anyone else like this, you'll be answering to more than just me. Understand?" The two men exchanged a glance, the shorter one looking ready to fold, but the taller man hesitated. "You think you can just—" "Do you know who I am?" Dolly interrupted, her voice calm but deadly serious. The man froze. "Yes, ma'am." "Then you know I keep my promises. Now if you'll excuse us, my friend and I have breakfast to finish." The taller man's jaw tightened, but he nodded curtly and motioned for his colleague to follow. As they left, the tension in the diner eased, conversation slowly resuming. Earl exhaled shakily, his hands trembling as he placed his fork down. "You didn't have to do that, ma'am. Now you're stuck dealing with my mess." Dolly shook her head. "You're not a mess, Earl. You're just a man who's been through hell. And if I have anything to say about it, you're going to come out the other side stronger." Earl's eyes glistened with unshed tears. For the first time in years, he felt like someone saw him not as a problem, but as a person. But as the two continued their breakfast, Dolly couldn't shake the feeling that this was just the beginning. Whatever had brought Earl to this point wasn't over yet, and she was determined to see it through no matter what it took. As the morning stretched on, Dolly and Earl stepped out of the diner, the warmth of breakfast lingering but the tension from earlier still heavy in the air. Earl wheeled himself along the sidewalk, his mind racing with thoughts of what had just happened. He couldn't shake the feeling that this temporary moment of peace was just that temporary. "I don't know how to thank you," he said, his voice low as he glanced up at Dolly, "but you don't have to keep putting yourself out for someone like me." Dolly stopped in her tracks and turned to face him, her hands resting firmly on her hips. "Earl, I've told you before, and I'll say it again, you're worth it. Don't let anyone make you feel like you're not." Before he could respond, the screech of tires pierced the air. A familiar black SUV pulled up to the curb, and Fred, Dolly's assistant, stepped out, his expression a mix of frustration and concern. "Dolly," he said, his voice sharp but measured, "I just got a call. Those shelter guys, they're not done. They've gone to the press, and now reporters are asking why you're defending someone with unpaid debts." Earl froze, his stomach sinking. "They're going to ruin you," he muttered. "All because of me." Dolly's jaw tightened, but her voice was steady. "Let them try." Fred stepped closer, lowering his voice. "It's not just about the press. They've contacted the city council. They're pushing to have him banned from public spaces, calling him a nuisance. If we don't do something, Earl's going to lose what little he has left." Dolly's gaze shifted to Earl, who sat in his wheelchair, his shoulders slumped under the weight of yet another blow. But instead of despair, she felt a fire ignite within her. She wasn't just going to help Earl, she was going to fight for him. "Get me their names," she said to Fred, her voice firm. "And call the mayor's office. I've got a few things to say." Fred hesitated. "Dolly, are you sure? This could get messy." She turned to him, her eyes blazing. "Fred, the world's already messy. The only way it gets better is if we roll up our sleeves and do something about it." As Fred reluctantly nodded and returned to the SUV, Dolly crouched down beside Earl. "You've been fighting alone for too long, Earl. But not anymore." Earl shook his head, his voice breaking. "Why? Why would you do all this for me?" Dolly smiled softly, placing a hand on his. "Because someone once did it for me. And now it's my turn." The next morning, the small town of Pigeon Forge buzzed with whispers. Outside the town hall, a crowd had gathered reporters, townsfolk, and even some of the same men from the shelter who had threatened Earl the day before. At the center of it all stood Dolly Parton, her presence commanding yet calm. Earl sat nearby, watching the scene unfold with a mix of apprehension and disbelief. He still couldn't fathom how his life had gone from the shadows of a back alley to the spotlight of a public fight. As Dolly stepped up to the podium, the murmurs faded. She scanned the crowd, her gaze steady, before speaking. "Ladies and gentlemen," she began, her voice resonating with conviction, "I stand here today not as a celebrity, but as someone who believes in the dignity of every human being. Earl Jenkins is a man who lost everything in the fire, his home, his belongings, even his hope. And instead of finding support, he was met with bureaucracy, judgment, and cruelty. The crowd stirred, some nodding in agreement, while others whispered among themselves. The shelter officials shifted uncomfortably, their earlier bravado now replaced with unease. Dolly continued, "I've seen what kindness can do. I've seen how one act of compassion can change a life. And I refuse to stand by while a good man like Earl is treated as if he doesn't matter. So today, I'm not just here to defend Earl. I'm here to start something bigger." She gestured toward Fred, who stepped forward with a large envelope. "This," she said, holding it up, "is a check to cover not just Earl's so-called debt, but enough to ensure that no one else in this town will ever be turned away from help when they need it most." The crowd erupted in applause, the sound washing over Earl like a tidal wave. Tears filled his eyes as he looked at Dolly, who gave him a reassuring smile. "But that's not all," she added, her voice rising above the noise. "Earl doesn't just deserve to survive, he deserves to thrive. That's why I'm also partnering with local businesses to help Earl get back on his feet, starting with a job and a place to live." The applause grew louder, and Earl could hardly believe what he was hearing. As Dolly stepped down from the podium, she walked over to him, kneeling beside his wheelchair. "Earl," she said softly, "it's time for you to believe in yourself again. You've got people rooting for you now." He wiped his eyes, his voice trembling. "I don't know what to say." "You don't have to say anything," she replied, squeezing his hand. "Just promise me you'll take this chance and run with it." The rest of the day passed in a blur. Reporters interviewed Dolly and Earl, local businesses pledged their support, and for the first time in years, Earl felt like he had a future worth looking forward to. That evening, as the sun dipped below the horizon, Earl sat in his new apartment, staring out the window. On the table beside him was a photo Dolly had given him, a simple picture of the two of them outside the diner. Beneath it, she had written in her unmistakable handwriting, "To new beginnings, keep the faith. Dolly." And for the first time in a long time, Earl allowed himself to smile. If this story moved you, don't wait, reach out to someone who needs help today. Together, we can make the world a little brighter. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe for more stories that inspire and remind us of the power of kindness. See you next time